So I thought we don't have a ton of time, but I thought I would just run through some things which are unique to medical inventions. And so I'm using that term medical inventions, thinking about stuff in the medical space, obviously therapeutics, drugs, proteins, but also medical devices, of course, a very big part of that. Perhaps digital health inventions as well. So let's talk about some things that are unique in that space that might not apply to all sorts of patents everywhere. And I think, of course, one of the biggest things, the kind of elephant in the room with this is that when you're talking about a medical invention, you do certainly want to get patent protection, but there's going to be another layer of regulatory review and approval that you're going to need just about everywhere, almost every country, before you can actually sell your, take your medical invention into the market, into the clinic, basically. And of course, in the US, that's FDA approval. So there's one specific thing about FDA approval that applies here, and that, of course, as all of you know, is that FDA approval, obtaining regulatory approval from the FDA is very expensive. And so that sort of expense means that your invention, you're unlikely, that is, to raise the sort of money that's going to be needed to take a medical invention all the way through FDA approval and into the clinic with your own funding. It's very unlikely you'll have the deep pockets for that. So that requires some fairly significant investment in you and your company and your idea. And to get the sort of money, the sort of investment that's going to take, you're going to be working with pretty sophisticated investors, that is, that have that kind of money to invest in, biotech applications, essentially. Certainly one of the most important questions they're going to ask you is, if I, the investor, I'm going to make this significant investment in you and your invention, I'm certainly not going to do that unless you have realistic and real protection for that invention of some sort. So they're going to want to know, before they make the investment, what sort of intellectual property protection you have. And hopefully you have, at least a patent application prepared and filed, and maybe some other layers, trademark design patents. Molly mentioned that earlier. A very useful tool, particularly for medical device inventions, can be used very intelligently to help as another layer of protection in that area, for example. So there's the expense that's required to get to approval, regulatory approval, and that only emphasizes the need for good intellectual property protection for medical inventions. There's also the effect on patent term that comes with this FDA regulatory approval. So as you start out, you're perhaps forming a startup company and you're starting to work and get intellectual property fairly early on. It's completely likely that you will actually get to some, for example, allowed or issued patents, both in the United States and other countries, for example. Other forms, design patents, maybe trademarks issued. You'll have some intellectual property protection starting to be issued and starting to accumulate these rights. But with the development process being as long as it is for a lot of medical inventions, this will come before you actually obtain FDA approval. So it's possible, of course, you'll have, for example, an issued US patent, which has a term of 20 years from the date you filed it, but you still won't be able to actually make and sell your invention, for example, let's say a drug, because you haven't obtained FDA regulatory approval yet. And so there's a specific way within the statutes of both the FDA and the Patent Office to kind of work together that they can add term, a certain amount of term, back to your patent life to compensate for the fact that you had issued patent, but you still weren't able to sell your drug or device because you were still working on getting FDA approval. So there's a difference there with patent terms for medical inventions. Also, I should throw in the fact that, if you're working on some sort of protein therapeutic, there's a lot of talk about vaccines and antibodies right now. Those sorts of things, there's been a special area of protection that's been carved out in the FDA for biologics, and that's outside of your, for example, patent protection and the term of that. And so that factors in about the best way to use that sort of protection too, that you need to think about and probably discuss with a patent attorney and other business professionals at the time if that's the area of medical invention that you're working in.